problem. The atheist tells us that selfish genes fighting for survival through the processes of evolution brought about what we refer to as human beings. And the entirety of the human framework controlled by those genes is geared towards the aims of that evolutionary process, namely survival, and not necessarily towards understandings of truth and reality. And so it becomes possible to argue that however much we may feel and think that there is an objective right and wrong, however much it might seem self-evidently true to us that some things are objectively wrong and evil, this is just an illusion which has been brought about by genes who have no regard for truth, but only to that which aids our chances of survival. If this is in fact the case, the atheist has a much bigger problem than the explaining of morality at hand. Our very minds, our very reasoning can no longer be trusted because we can only assume that they, controlled by our genes, are not geared towards truth but towards survival. And in fact, Professor John Gray, the famous atheist philosopher, concedes exactly this point when he writes this, that the human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. A staggering claim by someone who spent his entire life in the academy. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. John Lennox responds to Gray in quite a damning rebuttal. But what about Gray's own mind? One must suppose, according to Gray, that his writing this sentence, the human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth, serves evolutionary success. Well, it certainly would appear to serve the success of evolutionary theory if it were true, but then Gray has undermined the very concept of the truth and so has removed all reason for us to take him seriously. Logical incoherence reigns once more. There is a serious systemic problem in the atheist explanation of morality being just an illusion of our dreams and all of our genes, and all rationality becomes undependable in that framework. Leaving aside the systemic issue, we hit a second, more immediate issue. The claim that morality is an illusion brought about by our genes in the aim of gearing us towards survival doesn't seem to be at all intuitively borne out by the kinds of things that would seem to aid our survival, as opposed to the kinds of things that morality seems to demand of us. Greg Koukl puts it like this: consider two cavemen in neighboring villages. One kills the other in cold blood. We're being asked to believe he feels guilt because he realizes such an act ultimately undermines his own survival status. In the rest of the animal kingdom, killing the opposition seems to secure just the opposite. It's a little tongue-in-cheek, but the point remains. We are facing a massive pensions crisis in Europe at the moment. We're being told that we're sharing far too few resources amongst far too many people. We have growing, aging populations putting huge strain on our economies, on our health services, on our productivity measured in GDP. It might be possible to make an intuitive case for why you would continue to support the young, why we ought to care for the young, even though they strain the system, because the young ensure the future. The old, not so much. What about the disabled? What about the mentally incapacitated? It's not at all clear how care for the weak, the vulnerable, the sick, the dying, the elderly helps the survival of the selfish gene. Self-sacrifice in this kind of system should only be considered to be morally good if a weaker person lays their life down for a stronger. And yet it's a person like Mother Teresa who captures the global public imagination by setting for us an incredible standard of moral living. We applaud the character and the courage of those who lay their lives down for the weakest and the most vulnerable amongst us.
People are interested in having a spiritual life, but treat faith more like an a la carte menu at a restaurant, choosing what they like and dismissing the rest. Cutting through the hype and seduction is the clear voice of author and apologist Ravi Zacharias. In his book, Why Jesus? Rediscovering His Truth in an Age of Mass-Marketed Spirituality, Ravi answers the attraction known as the New Spirituality. Billy Graham calls Why Jesus a powerful defense of how Jesus Christ brings meaning and hope to an individual life. And Charles Swindoll says, I am not acquainted with a brighter mind or a more relevant and devoted defender of the faith than Ravi Zacharias. Why Jesus? Available in bookstores now or online at rzim.org.
There is a serious gap between what we actually find honorable, valiant, good, kind, righteous, and pure, and what we're being told is the impetus for that belief. And this kind of forced reasoning, the decision that there is no God and therefore the need to fudge the lines on morality, has raised some important questions and a significant backlash from within the atheist camp itself. It's been said that if you want to test a system of thought to see whether it's true, you have to firstly consider whether the claims that worldview is making are internally consistent. Secondly, test whether and see whether the claims of that worldview adhere to the external realities of our world, to the facts of history and so on. And thirdly, see whether it actually addresses the real experience and understanding of life. That third one is important, whether it actually addresses our real experiences of life. There is such a profound disconnect between the atheist worldview and our deeply ingrained experience and understanding of the moral values of our universe that it raises significant questions about the validity of that worldview. And in fact, Peter Cave, the humanist philosopher, writes, whatever skeptical arguments may be brought against our belief that killing the innocent is wrong, we are more certain that the killing is wrong than that the argument is sound. Whatever skeptical, this is an atheist speaking, whatever skeptical arguments may be brought against our belief that killing the innocent is wrong, we are more certain that the killing is morally wrong than that the argument is sound. I think the vast majority of human beings believe that torturing little babies for fun is objectively wrong, is evil. That rape and genocide are not just social constructs, are not just personal preferences that we believe are wrong, that they are objectively evil. That if, for example, if Hitler had succeeded in exterminating all of the Jews and winning the Second World War and indoctrinating every person on the planet so that the whole of the human race believed the Holocaust to have been a good thing, that it would still be objectively wrong, that it would still be evil for all people and for all times. You cannot ground that view. You cannot coherently ground that view in a godless universe. But this is where it becomes so vitally important which God we're talking about. It would be a mistake to think that you can posit any God you like and still account for the understanding of the moral law that we have. Everything hinges on the character of the God at the center of the story. In the Islamic worldview, you have a God who is not essentially good and who defines morality according to his commands. And many philosophers grappling with a theistic answer to the question of absolute morality have unthinkingly picked up actually an Islamic perspective and raised some significant and very important objections to it. It's called the Euthyphro dilemma. If good is simply defined by whatever God commands, then morality is arbitrary. God could command you to kill everyone who disagrees with you, and we would have to consider that by definition to be good because God has commanded it. Morality becomes arbitrary. If we push back and say, oh no, God commands things because they are good, there is a reference point to which he's looking and he looks at them and says, this is good, then we don't need God in the first place. Why don't we go to that reference point ourselves? We can bypass God altogether. It's a significant challenge. The Christian reality is profoundly different. God himself is the plumb line. We're not saying that whatever he commands becomes good. We're saying God himself is the plumb line. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. That's the wonderful, ringing affirmation of Scripture. The Bible presents to us the God who, in the words of 1 John, is light and in whom there is no darkness at all. The God who does not change like shifting shadows. The God who keeps his promises. The God who is faithful. The God who does not lie. The God who is truth. The God who hates injustice. The God who judges justly. The God who is righteous. The God who cares for the weak, the destitute, the broken, the widow, the fatherless. The God who is kind. The God who is gentle. The God who is love. The moral law is not grounded in the commands of God. It's grounded in the character of God. It's so important that the command of God to us in Scripture is not simply be holy according to my commands. It is so much more profound than that. Be holy as I am holy. It's a unique command, because no other God either makes or sustains that claim to absolute holiness. When a Christian makes the claim that there is such a thing as an objective moral standard, a solid, immovable, unshakable ground in the sea of change, we are saying that there is a God, the rock, whose character provides that standard and whose commands are entirely in keeping with his character. I think David saw this when he was writing in the Psalms. Open my eyes that I might see wonderful things in your law. The moral law is a glimpse into the glory of God himself. I'd like to take these last minutes to look at a more personal end of these questions. I started by reminding us of some of the stories, even in these past months, that have been in the news, that highlight again the reality of the moral disintegration for our nations. We are in desperate need for the church to find her public voice on these issues and to speak with a prophetic insight and with truth and conviction as well as with compassion. But I think it's too easy, far too easy and convenient to get all passionate and vocal about the ills elsewhere. We are so good at pinning the blame elsewhere. We make it about other people and their issues and their faults. As you know, many of the teams spend quite a considerable time on university campuses throughout the year engaging with students about the person of Christ. I was so struck a couple of years ago when I was at Bath University in the UK with a tiny minority of students professing Christians, that the vast majority filling out our surveys said that they struggled with guilt. The truth is that we can talk about moral values as abstract concepts for hours on end and it have no impact. But it takes 1 second's worth of a bad decision to make a lifetime's worth of regret. An illicit relationship you never intended to get into, words spoken in anger and in haste that you can never take back, things that you've done to others or have had done to you that you've never recovered from. Perhaps the most well-known of letters ever written into a newspaper was G.K. Chesterton's letter to the Times. The Times had run an article entitled, "What's Wrong with the World?" to which Chesterton had written this reply: "Dear sirs, in response to your article, What's Wrong with the World? I am yours sincerely, G.K. Chesterton." These are no glib reply. These two little words point us to the profound reality that each and every one of us are broken and in desperate need of forgiveness. We've gotten so good at convincing ourselves that we are relatively good. I wonder if we ever really stop long enough to think, well, what about the bad parts then? What happens to them? Do they need to be accounted for? Isaiah writes these solemn words, "We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." It's so important that we remember this. We all stand on the same ground before the cross. We are in desperate need of forgiveness. The problem of guilt and the need for forgiveness. Secondly, the longing for justice and the need for judgment. As real as our guilt is, I think that the deeper longing for many of us is justice. When we look at the oppression around the world, when we look at the oppression we've suffered in our own lives, we long for justice. The atheist tells us that there will be no day of reckoning, there will be no judgment, and therefore there will be no justice. That the only justice that we can hope for is whatever can be meted out by our law courts in this life. And you have cases like we've just had in the UK, Jimmy Savile. In his own lifetime, a legend, awarded an OBE, knighted. 4,000 people came to his funeral. Huge wealth, public praise and adoration. We don't know where to go with the tens and tens and tens of young people that he abused, that we're only now discovering the broken lives that have been left behind in his wake. No justice. Richard Dawkins writes in his book, River Out of Eden, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." Is he serious? Have you seen the news recently? The decapitated heads of children paraded like trophies, really neither good nor bad? I couldn't disagree more. Quite the contrary. Immanuel Kant famously wrote, "Two things fill the mind with ever-increasing wonder and awe, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." He was right to be awed by it. There is the persistence of a plumb line that is independent of us, that simply will not go away. And we all know that we've transgressed it. And no explanation outside of the Judeo-Christian worldview accounts for the existence of that standard, the guilt that is very real, the need for forgiveness, and the longing for justice. I'd like us to consider again the cross, the justice of God, the judgment of God, the mercy of God, the love of God, the holiness of God, the forgiveness of God, and the person of Christ. God himself embodies the good, overcomes evil, and makes a way for us. The existence of objective moral values not only give us good reason to believe in God, they give us a glimpse of that God himself and bring us back to this most glorious of Gospels. Our guilt has been dealt with, forgiveness is offered, and justice ensured.
Suffering, God's silence, the existence of truth. Those are just a few of the topics covered in RZIM's Just Thinking magazine. Editor Daniel Durant.
I'm often encouraged by letters we receive regarding just thinking. You never know what one sentence can do in the life of an individual. We've gotten a number of letters from those who are outside of Christianity, but they found something intriguing in just thinking and said, I want to read more.
Sign up for email delivery of Just Thinking at rzim.org.
Is it historically reasonable? Are the Gospels historically reasonable and reliable to a certain degree that we can measure as historians? And I think we would say yes, they are. And there are reasons for that, for testifying to the resurrection of Jesus. First of all, we don't just have one Gospel, we have 4 Gospels. 4 Gospels that tell us the same thing, that Jesus was raised from the dead. Second of all, we have Paul's letters corroborating this fact that Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, they corroborate one another because many of Paul's letters, most of Paul's letters, in fact, were written before the Gospels. So here's my third point, here's this Jew who at one point is persecuting the church violently, held the jackets and coats of those who stoned Stephen, as we see in the book of Acts. Yet somehow this Jew becomes a believer in Jesus and a follower of Jesus, so much so that he becomes the chief apostle and the chief witness, chief apologist, as you will, for the Christian faith. Now, how do you explain that historically?
And then you have the discovery of the empty tomb being attributed to women. Now, in the first century, women were not considered credible witnesses in a court of law. If a woman witnessed a crime, she could not go to court and testify because her testimony was not taken seriously. So why would the disciples pick women to be the witnesses to the resurrection unless that's really what happened? They were just reporting what happened. And then you have the disciples of Jesus coming to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and like I said, preaching that beginning in Jerusalem and then going all the way to their death. Now, people would die for things that they think are true, even though they're mistaken. They would die for that if they really believe that what they're dying for is true. But if they know that it is not true, if they were making it up, they would have known it wasn't true, and then they would not have been prepared to die for it. And they died in separate places, all convinced that Jesus had appeared to them alive after the crucifixion.
We often find that immediate objection comes up against an anti-supernaturalism. The person is arguing from philosophical naturalism or materialism, in which their world there is no possible intervention in their system. So basically they believe in a universe of cause and effect within a closed system. And the idea, therefore, is that as Christians or religious people, we are somehow invoking a world of fantasy and unbelief. But we believe in a universe of cause and effect in an open system, that there's an agency that can act. So I think what we've got to define, and I know in my own case when I've had this discussion with people talking about miracles and so forth, or the possibility, is that if God exists, by definition, miracles would be logically possible. I mean, if he's a greater being than by which anything else exists, he is the greatest of all, is he omniscient, all-powerful and so forth, then the very name God carries the attributes of the ability to do anything within his system.